In 1977, two psychologists at Stanford ran an experiment that produced a result most people refuse to believe applies to them. They showed participants a debate. Capital punishment. Does it deter crime? Half the group supported the death penalty going in. Half opposed it. Both sides received identical evidence, identical studies, the same raw data laid out in the same order. By the end of the session, both groups were more certain than ever that they had been right from the beginning. Not less certain. More. The researchers, Lee Ross and Charles Lord, published their findings under a term they called biased assimilation. Evidence, it turned out, doesn't arrive in the brain as neutral information waiting to be evaluated. It arrives as a challenge or a confirmation, and the brain decides which one it is before conscious reasoning has time to start. The mechanics of biased assimilation work like this. When you encounter a study or an argument that supports what you already believe, you tend to rate it as credible, well-designed, and worth citing. When the same quality of evidence contradicts your position, you begin searching for reasons to discount it. The methodology seems weak. The sample size looks too small. The researchers may have had an agenda. What's striking is that the more sophisticated your reasoning is, the more convincing your objections become. Intelligence doesn't protect against the bias. It supplies better tools for maintaining it. The participants in Ross and Lord's experiment weren't passive or incurious. They were Stanford undergraduates who cared about the issue. When flaws were pointed out in a study that confirmed their view, they noticed fewer of them. When an identical flaw appeared in research that challenged them, they caught it immediately. The bias was directional, systematic, and completely invisible to everyone experiencing it. In 2002, Emily Pronin at Princeton published a paper on a related phenomenon she called the bias blind spot. She asked participants to rate their own level of bias compared to the average American. Almost universally, people placed themselves below average. They saw themselves as more objective than most, more balanced, less susceptible to motivated reasoning. Then she had them complete a battery of tasks specifically designed to surface well-documented cognitive biases. People who showed clear, measurable bias on those tasks still insisted afterward that they were less affected by it than the people around them. The results didn't change their self-assessments. Knowing what a bias is, it turned out, doesn't protect you from it. Pronin ran the study a second time. She showed participants how other people had rated their own objectivity. They could see that every other participant was also claiming to be less biased than average. On a purely logical level, they understood that this was impossible. Exactly half of any group sits above the median. The other half does not. They acknowledged this. They still didn't revise their own scores. The bias blind spot is uniquely resistant to correction because it runs on the same reasoning machinery that produces bias in the first place. The more confident you are in your own logic, the harder your errors are to see from the inside. In 1983, Swedish psychologist Ola Svensson published a study that documented a version of this at scale. He asked people to rate their own driving ability compared to everyone else on the road. 93% of American participants placed themselves in the top half for safety. 89% of Swedish participants said the same. This effect, which researchers now call illusory superiority, has been replicated across virtually every domain that anyone has thought to test. Leadership ability, ethical behavior, memory, athletic performance. In one survey of surgeons, 94% rated themselves as above average in their field. That number is mathematically impossible, and yet the pattern holds, study after study, country after country, profession after profession. The most documented version of this phenomenon was named in 1999. David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger at Cornell University tested participants on logical reasoning, English grammar, and the ability to recognize genuinely funny jokes. The people who scored in the bottom quartile on every single test estimated their own performance at roughly the 62nd percentile. They weren't exaggerating strategically. They genuinely believed it. Dunning called this the double burden of incompetence. You lack the skill and you simultaneously lack the metacognitive ability to recognize that you lack it. The competence required to evaluate your own competence is precisely the competence that hasn't developed yet. The people with the least accurate self-assessments are also the people least equipped to correct them. The effect ran in the other direction as well. The highest performing participants in Dunning and Kruger's study consistently underestimated how far above their peers they actually sat. They assumed that the tasks they found straightforward must be straightforward for everyone. The longer you work in a domain, the harder it becomes to reconstruct what it felt like not to understand it. Psychologists describe this as the curse of knowledge. Experts routinely overestimate how quickly other people can reach conclusions that feel automatic to them, and how much background others bring to a problem that, for the expert, dissolved into intuition years ago. These patterns don't stay inside controlled experiments. In 2012, researchers at Harvard published findings from Project Implicit, a database accumulated from over 1 million participants across 34 countries. The study measured implicit associations, the automatic connections the brain draws between concepts in milliseconds, well before deliberate thought has time to form. Participants who explicitly reported no racial preferences still showed consistent, measurable automatic associations favoring certain groups in their response time data. The gap between what people believed about themselves and what their reaction times revealed was wide and stable across demographics. Education level didn't close it. Age didn't close it. Awareness that the test was measuring implicit bias didn't close it either. The associations ran beneath the level that intention can reach. Daniel Kahneman spent 4 decades building the framework that explains why all of this keeps happening. His research with Amos Tversky, beginning in the early 1970s and culminating in his 2011 synthesis, describes a brain running 2 separate systems. One is fast, automatic and pattern-driven, operating almost entirely below the level of awareness. The other is slow, deliberate and effortful, and it's far less active than most people assume. Your first reads of situations, your confidence in your own conclusions, your judgments of the people around you, almost none of them arrive through careful, deliberate analysis. They come from the fast system, which is optimized for speed and conservation of energy rather than accuracy. The slow system can correct the fast system, but only if it notices that a correction is needed. And the fast system almost never announces itself. It simply delivers its conclusions. They feel from the inside exactly like reasoning you did yourself. The researchers who study this most closely tend to share one consistent finding. Awareness of bias reduces it only slightly and only in narrow circumstances. Direct feedback on specific errors tracked over time produces some measurable improvement. Abstract knowledge that bias exists does essentially nothing. In 2015, a large-scale replication project published in Science attempted to reproduce 100 studies from top psychology journals. Only 39% replicated successfully at the original effect size. The bias findings were among the most robust that survived. The blind spot, the double burden, the implicit associations, those held up. They held up because they're not describing unusual conditions or rare failures of reasoning. They're describing what human cognition does by default, in ordinary circumstances, in people who would describe themselves as careful and fair-minded. The data suggests that most of them are wrong about that.